All right, so let's see. Let's take a look at implementing a profile. Once in the profile, I like to be able to retrieve a particular user, right? So let's do that. Let's see. We have on the server, on the database, we have. Let's see, who do we have? We have Alice, Bob, Dan. So let's retrieve Alice. Okay. So we know Alice is logged in. So we need to retrieve Alice's information to display in the profile. All right. So let's do that. So let's take a look at the controller for the profile. So we are. This is the login. This is the controller for the profile, right? We'll have our init function here. So init, and the first thing that we'll do is retrieve that particular user. Right? We know their ID. Their ID is 7. So let's take a look at that. So we'll do we'll put that in a function. We'll do find user by ID, and the ID is in this case 7. And we'll implement this function right here. We'll say find user by ID. That takes as argument the user ID. Right? And the implementation will be very much like the fetch over here, right? So let's remove this fetch here that didn't work for us. We'll do fetch. The URL that we're going to hit is if you remember, we introduced the notion that these URLs had a specific syntax, right? For instance, this one over here, /API/user, this could be interpreted as retrieve for me all users, right? I'm not specifically referring to any particular user, so the basic interpretation is that I want all the users, right? But if I indeed provide you with a unique identifier, then I mean that specific user, right? So let's create here an API that will allow me to retrieve a specific name, a specific user, right? If I know their ID. For instance, Alice is ID number 7. Right? So let's create here a get mapping that retrieves for me /API /user, and then the placeholder, the user ID, as the last element of that URL. Okay. All right. So we'll map that to a function that returns a single user, and to a function also that retrieves a user by its user ID. Right? And it takes as argument the ID of the user that we want to retrieve, which we're going to have to parse from the path parameter that is being provided here. You see that? All right, so let's see how do we do that. Okay. So here we want a string. Actually, we know it's going to be an integer, right? Most of the time, it's just going to be an integer. But we don't know. If this might be a unique identifier, we might use a GUID, right, as a unique identifier. So we can't guarantee that it's an integer. Right? So it's safer to just map it to a string, even though we know that in our database, right, we are using indeed an integer, right, an auto increment. But if we decide to move this to a different database, maybe a MongoDB database later on, MongoDB doesn't use integers, right? It uses a GUID, a unique identifier, right? So to make it safe, it's safer to just map it to just a generic string, okay? Even though we know in this case that it's an integer, all right? Yes.
Will the ORM be able to do the mapping?
We'll need to cast it. Yeah, we'll need to make sure that we cast it. Yeah, the ORM expects it to be an integer. Yep. All right. So here we have a user ID, and we're going to parse it out from the request parameter here, right? So this will be a path variable, I think it is. There we go. Yep. The variable is called user ID. So we're going to parse this from the path, and we're going to instantiate this user ID string and pass it to the argument of this find user by ID. Mapping, we need to type that correctly. And let's see if our repository can find a user by primary key. So we'll do a find Find by ID. There it is. Find by ID. Find by ID takes as argument an integer, but we have a string, so we'll need to convert it, right? We'll need to parse it. All right, so we have let's parse that. This will be an integer, and this will be the ID parsed from that string. So this will be something like integer dot parse int, and then we can pass in the user ID. Obviously, we'll have to do a try catch, make sure that we can indeed parse it, right? If something went wrong, we might throw back an exception. I'm not going to do that. I'm lazy. I'm going to pass in that ID right here. And hopefully that will return that a single user by primary key. So we can just return that. Now that, all right, so notice that it's complaining that is an optional user, that it returns an optional, meaning that this could be null, right? There might be no user mapped to that ID, right? So to handle the fact that this could be null, it wraps the user in this optional object, right? Which is fine. We can change the return type to be optional user, right? Meaning this could return null as opposed to just an actual object. So on the client, you would need to be able to handle that, right? That you're not getting an actual object. All right, so let's try that. If we restart the server, we can try that API just by hitting it in the URL. We'll wait for the server to boot up. So now we know Alice is mapped to the ID number 7, right? So if we do a /API user /7, we should get back Alice. So let's try that out. So this would be API /user /7. We get Alice, right? Or any of the other users, right? All right, so we want to use this API from within our profile page, right? So we've navigated to the profile page. We know it's this particular user ID. Let's retrieve Alice, and then we want to populate our form, right? So that folks can edit, maybe change the password, add more information about their first name, their last name, and whatnot. So let's do that. In the controller now, we can go back and use this find user by ID. We just implemented it on the server. It'll be /API. There'll be a user. Concatenated with the user ID that we're passing here as an argument. It's going to be a get, so I don't have to change anything, right? I don't need to change anything. And then, so this is going to be a then. So this is going to come back from the server. Something's going to come back from the server. Let's see what comes back from the server. Now, we could have a function here that handles that, right? We can have function, and this could be, handle response. Right? And then we can provide this handle response here as an argument, yes? All right? But let me just show you an alternative syntax, which for me is a little bit disturbing, right? But it's very, very common in JavaScript, right? For those that are coming from Java, this might not be as common. Here you can provide an anonymous function here, like a lambda function. That's kind of like a throwaway function. That will be the function that will be called by the then, eventually. Right? I'm passing it as an argument, a function embedded here, and here's the response coming back. So the then will eventually call this function, will pass whatever comes back from the server. Okay? All right. So let's see. Let's console log what that is. Console log what that is. Response. All right. So here's our init. We're going to call init explicitly, and the init will call the find user by ID, and it pass in the 7, right? And the 7 will call the fetch. Yes? All right, let's try it out. So let's go back to our profile page. No, our profile. Where's our profile page? Profile. There we go. Notice that it hit the 7. It went out. Right, and it came back with Alice. Right, so indeed it came back with the data from the server. We have that in the response. Let's look at the console. Where's the console? There we Notice that in the console, though, right? The console actually it's an embedded object that contains the actual response from the server, of which the user is embedded in the body of that response that came from the server. Yeah. So the response is this meta object that includes the status, it was successful, it was 200, header, including the cookie and all that. We don't care about any of that, right? What we care is about the actual object that is embedded in the response. Yes? So we need to parse it out as a JSON from the body. So to do that, right? What we're going to do here is actually we're going to do return. We're going to return the response. We're going to return the response.json. .json is a function that unwraps the body. Right? Now the body could contain anything: images, it could contain a PDF document, right? Anything that we're downloading from the server. In this particular case, we know it's a JSON object. We know it's a string that is coming from the server, and we know that it's formatted in JSON. Right? So the .json here on the response, right? It's assuming a lot of things. It says, oh, you're assuming that this is whatever's in the body is indeed a string, and that it's parsable as a JSON object. Okay. Right? So it's going to parse it, and that's what we're going to return. We're going to return that. So there's two returns inside of each other. Right? So this over here, that response is that JSON parsing is also asynchronous. Okay, something could go wrong, and here in the init is we're going to finally retrieve whatever that comes back from that JSON, and here we can do presumably here is our actual user parsed from the JSON, and we can do a console. Here we can do a console log user. Okay, so now if we do console, notice that indeed now we are printing the actual user that was parsed from the body. Okay, lots of embedded asynchronous calls here, right? But that's the nature. We're talking something that is not running on your same CPU, right? It's running elsewhere, right? And you need these promises going around. All right. So what we're going to do here? What do we want to do with the actual user? We want to render that user in the user interface, yes, so that you can actually edit it. Maybe provide a first name and last name, maybe change the password, do stuff with it. Okay. So let's do that next.